Hello, and welcome back to It's a Spectrum, the podcast where we explore, navigate the personal experiences of people with neurodivergencies. Before we get started, make sure like, subscribe, leave a comment, watch all the way if you can. We're at Radar Pod on all platforms, and we have merch. To show you some of it, we have stickers, mugs, and a shirt. I love this shirt. And if you want to support the podcast in any other way, we have a Patreon. We have a donation tier. We also have exclusive content tiers. And we just introduced sponsorship tiers. So for $100 a month, you and your small business or work project get an ad for the whole month. We have a great guest, Lucky, at Lucky Leftie on most platforms, also known as Lottie. How's it going? How you doing?
How's it going?
Good, great, good. So I only found out this recently, but you identify as being on the spectrum as well, right?
I am.
Yes. Can you tell us a little bit about what that journey was like?
Okay, so it's one of those situations where there's a lot of neurodivergent people in the family,
Right.
but nobody has ever been formally diagnosed because they were born during the 1970s and they didn't even realize that non-white people could be autistic. They hadn't gotten to that bit yet.
For sure.
So when I was a child, I had a lot of very noticeable symptoms, but basically every single member of my family went, wait, we did that as kids. Nothing strange about this situation.
Yeah.
So it wasn't really until I was about 16 that I started looking into the diagnostic process. I realized actually through a children's book that this was very likely what was up.
That's funny.
I don't remember the name of it, and I wish I did. But it basically was like about a little boy with autism, and it described like his day-to-day life, his day-to-day struggles, all his symptoms. And I basically did what my family did, and I was like, but I do all those things. And then there was like a moment of silence, and then...
Right.
So it wasn't until I was 18 that I actually sought out a formal diagnosis. My friends joke around that I had kind of like a reverse situation happened because this usual stereotype is that an autistic woman comes in to be diagnosed and walks out with a borderline personality disorder diagnosis. I still wasn't 100% sure what was happening. So I was actually going in for a borderline personality disorder assessment. And I didn't walk out with an autism diagnosis at that time, but that was what helped jumpstart, the diagnostic process. I was very, very open about it for a long time in college and online. And then I had an extended period of time where I was like, I don't know if this is information that I'm comfortable people having access to, but given the fact that I'm on this podcast, you can see I've clearly gotten over it. But that's the crude summary of how it started. I can go into more detail on any of these one things if you'd like.
Well, you said that you pursued diagnosis at 18?
Yes.
What was that like?
It's hard doing it at 18, and it's hard breaking the news to your family too. I've only really broken the news to like my mother and sister and it feels weird because they've lived with you your entire life,
right.
And you should think it should be obvious, but it feels very strange like actually saying it out loud.
Yeah.
I have no shame regarding it, but it was one of those things that felt very difficult for me to cross for some reason. I think there's also there's a lot of pain that comes with doing it a little bit later in life, especially if you're the one that's guiding yourself versus a doctor or a trusted authority figure flagging it, because you think back on all these instances where you slip through the cracks and you have to come to terms with that. I think the world is very hostile to young autistic people, autistic women especially. I know young autistic men don't get it that much better either. But so much of like a woman's social life is centered around these unspoken signals, these hidden meanings behind random turns of phrase. So to be sort of locked out on that and realize, oh, this wasn't because there was something fundamentally wrong with me, or that I had like any of these sort of like evil projections. It's just because this is the way that I am,
Yeah.
It took me a long time I was never like angry about the diagnosis, or I never thought of myself as lesser because of the diagnosis, but it was the sort of thing that was a little bit difficult to reconcile with my lived experiences.
Yeah, no, I definitely get that. And I definitely feel like We've mentioned that before, where a lot of the guests that I've had from the get-go have been women and female presenting, and a lot of it is, I've said before, like a lot of it is because that's who's having the conversation right now.
Yeah.
And a lot of that is driven from like that's who has been unacknowledged for so long, and so finally we are acknowledging that, and now that is the new area, the new field of research that's being viewed.
Yes.
There's so much that in general is still not known about autism, but specifically so much about people of color and specifically women of color. And that's just, where the dice lay, I guess.
That's where the dice lay.
I don't know if that's how dice... I think
that's how the dice roll, I think, is the actual saying.
For some reason I said dice, but I was thinking of dominoes.
It's because we're Hispanic.
Maybe. I don't know. No, I mean, you mentioned, so you pursued it mostly on your own. I definitely relate to that feeling of like coming to the family, especially like when there's so... I definitely believe that I was a point of reference for a lot of my family growing up. I think that I was the first one officially diagnosed with anything. I was diagnosed around 14 or 15. But the conversation about that started so much earlier. Yeah. And I tell this part a lot as well, is the school definitely thought that I was deficient in something, but they couldn't necessarily identify it. They didn't, necessarily, and it's not on them. They didn't have the resources to pursue that. They could only recommend that to my mom. And of course, my mom wanting the best for me wasn't ignoring it, but she definitely didn't want to make it easy for them to just push me in special ed and just like not think about me. So she actually fought for better accommodations, and there was a lot of experimenting that came because of that. I don't think I was like the poster child for changes at that school, but I definitely think that parents doing what my mom was doing, and specifically what my mom was doing, was the catalyst for the school. Like the schools were already going through transitions of their own separately. And I think my mom made sure that kids like me were included in that. It was weird growing up like that, because before the official diagnosis, before official accommodations, they did weird things. Like they knew that I was terrible at taking notes in math.
Oh, yeah.
But that once I learned the concept, I could memorize the concept. I tested well in math. So instead of giving me homework, they had me play Math Blasters or Astro Blasters. It's a math learning game.
Yes, I used to play it when I was in school too. That's why it makes me laugh, because that's kind of a blast from the past. No pun intended.
And it was a funny thing. I think it's a joke I tell too, because they didn't have all the games. They only had the ones. They had the ones. They bought them, I think, for me, and so they only bought the ones relevant to the lessons I was learning, and then they ran out. So then the next year, I went back to the textbooks. It was a fun process. Well, not always fun, but so I definitely relate to that, being like the first in your family to officially be diagnosed. And it's so funny now because for so long, I think that once they couldn't ignore it, a lot of my family and friends separated it unintentionally. Of like, okay, well then that's the thing to know about Ryan, is he's the autistic one. Yeah. And then, the last, I want to say 5-6 years, a lot of cousins, a lot of older generation, I think it starts with a lot of their kids.
Yes.
Get diagnosed, and now they start recognizing, okay, so if he is and she is, then the fact that we do the same thing might be something. Yeah. And I think that was a funny transition.
It's so interesting to think of the way that they like compartmentalized it, pre-diagnosis. Like I remember I asked my little sister, there's this very common dynamic with autistic sisters, where especially if they're the older sister, where the younger sister is treated as the older and expected to assume the role of older, which drove me ballistic because I saw it as like a coup. But I remember asking my sister, and she was like, did mom or dad like ever have your sister is a little bit different from other people conversations? And she was like, yeah, but it was never something that we sort of pursued. It was just like an accepted fact of life. Oh, Lottie's a little bit different than other kids. Yeah,
there was definitely that period in my adolescence as well. Sorry.
No worries.
I have this thing, and people commented on my old podcast too. I have this thing where it's like, I empathize by sharing experience.
This is how our people do. No need to clarify
being like part of the interview.
No, I understand.
But that was such a huge thing in my like close family specifically. Is like, that was how we started out. Was like, now that we knew that I was different, that was always put into perspective before we handled me. For lack of better phrasing. And then once we were adults and I did the research on my own to learn new things and function as an adult living with like ADHD and autism and an OCD, I started seeing that in them. So now I'm coaching them.
Yes.
And it's just a funny thing.
It is. It's nice to get to be that other person for other people. Like, I remember when I was in college, I lived in my college's multicultural house, and I was very open about the fact that I was on the spectrum right from the first moment I moved in. But what made me laugh is that my female roommate, it was, I think 3 guys, 3 girls. She was paying more attention to like one of the other guys in the house. And she was like, oh my God, he acts just like you.
Yeah. I think the moment for me that was like that was... It wasn't another person, but it was... so my diagnosis story, a brief summation of it, was in middle school, I started to recognize like the difference in behaviors between me and other kids. And I learned about OCD.
Oh, yes.
Specifically, it's such a funny reference, but specifically it's a Scrubs episode where they have a doctor with OCD. And as I've grown up, this episode has been like such a huge thing for me in my life. Not just because it mentions OCD, but when you learn about Michael J. Fox battling with what he was battling with at the time, for sure you can see how he uses that in his portrayal, but we'll get into that later. So I approached my mom at the same time Tempo comes out. Temple Grandin comes out, the movie.
Yes.
And there's such a specific story where before we even agreed to get me assessed, we're all watching the movie. And there's this scene where she's staring at the chandelier. And I don't know why. I think it was my grandma that says, why is she staring at the chandelier? And I'm in the back, I think, making a sandwich or something. I'm not even watching the movie. And I look up and I go, oh, there's a piece missing. And then I go back to whatever I'm doing and they rewind it and they pause it. I'm like, there is a piece missing.
Yes, you just
knew. Then once I did that, it wasn't for me. It was for everyone else where there was a light bulb moment where my mom starts watching the movie and then remembering me and then it's like, oh, he did that. So that was kind of my moment in that regard. But it was actually my mom's moment.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, gosh. I remember my mom was kind of in denial at first because I still think there is that very heavy stigma. Just in general, I think a lot of people view like a diagnosis of being on the spectrum as being like you are incapable of caring for yourself in any meaningful way, shape, or form. You are incapable of engaging with other people. Like, I think for a long time she was like, but you go to school on your own, you live on your own, you do all these things. Yeah. How could this be compatible with that? But I think the more that time has progressed, the more that she's been able to like connect certain moments of my childhood with that and be like, that's what that was. Yeah. I used to, when I was growing up, my parents had this huge coffee table in the middle of our living room, and I used to stim around it for hours and hours and hours and hours. And they would be like, what is she doing? And they're like, oh, she's having a good time. Let's let her groove.
It's definitely fun to like reference stuff like that.
My dad would like be watching boxing games and he would like have a banana, and every like couple laps or so I would come over, take a bite, and then continue my...
That's funny.
Yeah, continue my grooving.
I did different stuff. I had a security blanket for the longest time. I did things like my favorite story. I wasn't that young, but it was more. I had a roommate, and I remember us having a conversation about me being autistic, and I was like, he was trying to understand what I meant by my brain is different. Yes, I was like, well, it just I take all the same information you do, but I have to take a different path to come to the same conclusions that you do. So it looks different. And he's like, that just sounds like people being different. I'm like, yeah. And I couldn't get him to understand. And then, one night he did his own podcast, and he at the time had 2 co-hosts, And one of them was like he really good friends with. The other one was like someone that he was starting to get to know, and they were like interested in each other. And they recorded at her house, and he, I think, is, you know, he's trying to play cool, be nonchalant. So instead of asking her out directly, he tries to set up a group thing that he knows the third host can't go to.
Oh.
So he's like, let's all hang out. And then she agrees. They know what's happening, those two. And even the third host, she's like, yeah, no, I have to go home. She was like married or something. And they happen to do it in front of me. And I was like, oh, I'm down. He pulls me aside and he's like, no. He says, just so you know, we're just being polite and inviting this person. Like, she's not actually coming. And what he meant was, like, it's just supposed to be me and this girl.
Yes.
We're going on a date. But what I heard was, we don't actually like this other person.
Yes.
But I invited her just to be safe, so don't tell her. And I'm like, okay, I won't tell her that you don't like her. Which is not true. They're best friends.
Yes.
They still do the podcast. But so then we go, and I go with them on their date, and then we come home, and it was fun, but something about it was awkward the whole time. And then I get home, and then I tell him, I was like, I just realized that you meant you wanted to be alone.
Yes.
That was a date that I just joined you on. He's like, yes. And I'm like, this is what I meant by I think differently. And he's like, yeah, I get that now.
Yeah.
So that was a fun moment.
Do you ever feel like you need like a people translator?
Sometimes, yeah. It's I've become like the people translator for like my family.
Yes.
It feels like, or there's definitely been moments where like the same as like I see the cock shooting in someone else's head, and like without thinking about it, I'll translate what is the miscommunication for them. I wish I had an example because this is a funny bit. I can't think of anything.
It's all good. It'll come to you later on.
But yeah, it definitely does help when someone can understand.
No worries.
For sure.
Okay.
Ooh.
I think you said we're good to go. Is that what you said? Yeah. Okay.
Oh, you just in the camera, so you just letting me know. Cool. Okay. What were we talking about?
People translators.
People translators. Yeah, I think that I definitely have I've gotten to a point now where like if I don't understand, I'm very, what's the word? Inquisitive of that.
Yes.
And even if it frustrates that other person, I am very specific about what they're asking. And it's become a thing where like, I understand that it's frustrating, but I have to maintain with them, as frustrating as it is for you, imagine me that I can't understand.
Yeah.
Like,
you see, that's the part of like autistic neurotypical relations I will never understand, why asking questions is perceived as like hostile or passive aggressive. Yeah. I think part of what's very difficult navigating social experiences as an autistic person is that so many people attach a malice to your actions or to your default state of being that just doesn't exist, but it's being projected onto you constantly, and you're just like, what the heck, man?
Yeah, it's constant, and it's to the point where what's funny is it was a thing that I developed as a habit intentionally only recently, relatively recently.
Yes.
I won't get into the whole story. There's a long, but I was working with someone for a long time, and I was the project we were working on was something I hadn't done before, so there's a learning curve for me, especially that I am autistic with ADHD, so I have poor communication skills, I have poor response skills. So it became a thing where like every time there was these moments where I would freeze or get flustered, or even like have executive dysfunction, they get frustrated with me, and towards the end of our partnership, I started being more adamant. It was like, I understand it's frustrating for you, but you have to understand that this isn't happening to you.
Yes.
It's happening to me. It affects you. That's the difference. And for other reasons, we just like stopped working together. But that was a switch flip for me from that point on, where like I have to be adamant about this stuff. Yeah. Otherwise, people won't make space for it.
And sometimes even when you are adamant about it, a lot of people I've noticed, especially like more recently, when people on the spectrum started becoming more visible, a lot of people would be like, oh, of course I understand this. Of course I'm accepting of it. But when it came to actual practice, there's been multiple people I've known that I've come out to, I don't know if that's the appropriate term, but I've told, and fast forward a couple months, minor disagreement, something related to this is thrown in my face. Oh, I know you're lying because you can't look me in the face right now, or something of that nature. And I'm like, no, we've been over this.
Yeah, it definitely gets frustrating. There's sometimes where I have to like remind people.
Yes.
I think I have a joke about that, about how like learning I make the joke about my mom just because I joke about my mom a lot, but it's not actually based specifically on her. It's based on this concept of like, of that very thing of like people understanding when it's explained to them, but when they actually have to deal with it, it's you know, a lot more reactionary. And it'll be essentially the joke is like they hate that they have to remember that I'm autistic.
Yes. I think it's like, it's okay if they don't see like any visible like symptoms, or if your behaviors don't affect them in any meaningful way. But as soon as they do, they're like, what do you mean? The disorder that you have actually has other things attached to it.
That, along with some of the other things we've mentioned, is why I enjoy that they have started introducing the 3-level system. The
3-level system. I remember I got diagnosed just around the time that started being implemented. Yeah. And I remember thinking it was a little funny. I was like, oh, I got a power up. I'm level 2.
I liked it. It's so funny because it's, you know, with TikTok and everything, the zeitgeist is always like 5 years behind the terminology. So it's like a lot of people are mentioning the levels now, but they've existed for over a decade.
They've existed for a while.
Yeah. They literally like were coincided with the absorption of Asperger's and everything with 2013 DSM-5.
Oh man, they're still having Asperger's discourse on TikTok. Yeah, it's a deep, dark place right now.
It's so frustrating. And I get advice from people who's like, look, the last argument I got with someone was like, look, I need you to understand, if you want to call it that, if that's your classification, that's fine, but it's still it's still autism. Yes. That's what it is. Classification is just a distinction between you and people of lower levels, and that distinction only benefits your personal ego and the people that don't want to acknowledge that you have disability. But eventually it'll, you know, come up.
Yeah. You know, this is probably going to piss some people off, but my thought was, why would you want to cling to it for the name alone? Yeah. It's Asperger's, you know? Like, just say it out loud. It's just accept that they've absorbed the label.
I don't get why people want Asperger.
Yes. I'm like, come on. It already had probably like one of the worst names. Just phonetically, you know, Asperger's.
Yeah. Some people will try to like be polite about it and say Asperger. I'm like, you don't have to be polite about it.
You don't have to add a British accent. We know how it's pronounced. Asperger's. That was terrible. I think it's also strange being on the spectrum on TikTok, because for a while I was active like on Autistatalk.
Right.
What a terrible place to be now. It is the trenches.
Like
I'm going to give you, and bear in mind, I'm not even actively involved in the discourse. I see it and I passively absorb what's happening through osmosis. But I think in the past 6 months, there's been you don't have to show any of the symptoms on the DSM-5 to be autistic discussion. Is autism actually a disability? And whenever I see questions like that, I don't want to assume the worst, but I'm like, what are you saying? You know, there's the saying, you know, you meet a person on the spectrum, you've met one person. All of our experiences are so varied and so different, but there's some questions that are just so bizarrely off from the very few things that all of us have in common that I can't help but be like, are you even attempting to communicate?
It's such a frustrating thing. I actually recently, the episode before this, instead of doing a guest, I did a whole like episode about terminology, about like correcting misconceptions, and you know, there's so many to address. So I definitely didn't get through all of them. But one of the biggest things was like, there is a distinction. Autism is a specific phenomena happening, and I was like, the terminology, the metaphor I always use for on this is, when I'm explaining the spectrum, is the spectrum is not a grading scale of less or more autistic. The spectrum does not determine there is a variance in the spectrum, but I tell people, because I feel like so many people don't understand the actual spectrum metaphor.
Yes.
So it's like, think of it like baseball stats on the back of a baseball card. You know, most players have similar stats in similar categories, and they vary in high and low, but they're in the same categories. And they're all part of being a baseball player, which means the only way that you have scores in your stats is if you're a baseball player.
Yeah.
Like, if you're not a baseball player, you don't have a baseball card.
Exactly.
If you're not autistic, you are not on the spectrum. That's how that works.
Yeah. And I think the autistic community has been battling the everybody's a little bit on a spectrum logic for years, but it is very frustrating. And I feel what happens on online spaces, and this is a shame, because I feel like communities shouldn't censor the way they speak just because this happens. But I feel like autistic people use like very colloquial terms, like to describe their lived experiences, or like, you know, they just tell a joke involving their symptoms. And because it's a joke, they're not going to devolve into like all the complexities of the symptom, because that ruins the joke. But people see like these sort of like flippant discussions, or like these like very like simplified terms, and they go, oh, that applies to me. Yeah. And it's frustrating because people attempt to explain, no, this has a lot more nuances than you're aware of. And people seem very hostile and resistant to this information. I actually had a situation on TikTok the other day. This is a good one. And I wasn't even talking about autism. I was talking about OCD. But I have a series called Word Crimes, where I talk about semantic shifting. So for anybody that doesn't know what semantic shifting is, that is basically the Flanderization of words. Language naturally progresses, but because of the internet, it happens at a much faster speed. What used to take years now takes months. What used to take months now takes weeks. Nice. So you have terminology that's associated with either developmental disabilities, neurodivergencies, or mental illnesses, and people take the terminology and they use it very flippantly. For things that terminology was never meant to apply to, thus distorting the meaning of the symptom and kind of wrecking the people that actually struggle with that symptom's ability to professionally receive help, which people argue doesn't happen, but I'm like, oh, yes, it does.
My biggest thing in that category is intrusive thought. I get in a lot of arguments about
that's also one of my big ones too. Probably because it is so heavily stigmatized, and that sort of flippant approach doesn't help. But I made like a 2-sentence video that was just saying, yo, look up the original meanings of these terms, because we're all guilty of like using language like kind of like shallowly, or not like thinking very much. That's something everybody's done. That doesn't make you a bad person, but it's just something, you know, you should monitor, be aware of, try to avoid. And there is a person that was like, Lucky Leftie is gatekeeping mental illness and says that she is the only one that can be mentally ill, despite the post having the clarification, me and millions of other people. 18,000 likes later. And it's so frustrating because people just want to be validated. People are so preoccupied with but if I don't feel perfectly validated, if something challenges me, even just a little bit, that is a personal attack on me and my character. And that means you are bad and evil. And it's just so frustrating because you can voice it so kindly. You can voice it so nicely and neutrally. You could use the most like non-emotive language ever, and people will still have like that hostile knee-jerk response. For something very simple in my eyes. Like, I don't think that's a big thing to ask people to do, you know?
Yeah, I think it's also
I'm not saying I think I'm better than you. I'm just like, hey, check it out, you know?
I think that's frustrating because I feel like it's often that, or like the dual side of it is they don't want to have to adjust to the specifics of it. Yes. Like the flip side that I get in arguments a lot with is people upset that I'm correcting a joke. And it's like, I don't go hard into it. I'm not, trolling or Karening.
You're just adding the clarification.
Literally, like, I talked about it in my last episode as well. There's this clip of this lady, and she's making a joke about this was still during the days of Hanukkah, and she's like, if you have the intrusive thought of lighting your joint with the menorah, don't worry about it. And then she makes the joke of it, like, that's okay. And so in my head, what I'm seeing is, first of all, it's not the proper use of intrusive thought, which is what I'm about to address. But secondly, the reason that I know that she's not trying to make content about intrusive thought is because she is accepting the act and validating it. And that's kind of like, if you know what intrusive thought is, it's the thing you don't want to do.
Yes.
So the fact that she wants to do it is what specifically separates it from. Yeah. So I don't say any of that. I just say, I don't think it's polite or rude, but it's also like up to the interpretation of the individual. I just say that's not what intrusive thoughts are.
Yeah.
And most people...
They say, kill him. Light him on fire.
Some people, one person specifically would not let it go. And she was like, yes, it is. And he's like... And literally, I don't respond. He's like, if you don't have the wherewithal to Google it before responding to me, then I'm not going to correct you. Or I'm not going to explain my correction. I'm just going to let you know. And so I say, yes, it is.
Yeah.
Or I say, that's not what you're saying. I say, yes, it is. Like, it's not. Yeah. And she's like, well, you don't know the context behind it. He's like, it doesn't. Yeah, it's not.
Like, it always blows my mind when people argue this has no effect on people whatsoever, because I can think of so many examples. And I'm like, of course you don't think this has any effect because you don't interact with these people. You're not one of these people, so you don't see this at all.
So that's what was crazy about it, was like the more resistant I was being, and it's literally just repeating was like, it is not.
It's not. Like, objectively.
This person would like started looking into it, looking it up, and then trying to work, like
twist the wordings that she found.
Work backwards to find the conclusion she had already established, and no matter what she came up with, I didn't explain myself. I just would come out as like, I understand what you're saying.
It's still
you're still not describing intrusive thought. You're describing impulsive thought. And I think eventually at the end, right before she like got to the blocking me energy,
the blocking you phase of the argument.
I need you to understand. I get that you Googled what intrusive thoughts were, but the core reason it's not is because she wants to do it. Mm-hmm. That's it.
Yeah.
It's like, it's considered socially inappropriate, but she's making a video specifically about it. And even if it's within the context of like, this is a faux pas, she is telling you that it's not. Yeah. That's the joke, is that it's not a faux pas, that it's not inappropriate just because your grandmother thinks so. That's the joke. Yeah. And so even if she might be addressing what can be considered something based in anxiety, it's still not intrusive
It's still not. Yes.
It's for it to be intrusive thought, it has to disrupt her functioning. Mm-hmm. Like, that's how that works.
And it usually has to bring distress too.
Yeah. Like it's an invading thought. Mm-hmm. It's intrusive, intruding. Yeah.
Like, you don't like you, if you have an intruder, you're not sitting them down and having a cup of tea with them. You want them out of your house, And that's the way I try to explain it. I'm like, just think of like what the word intrusive means, like the associations of that word. But like, whenever I think of people, or like whenever I meet people that are like, oh, semantic shifting has like no effect on people whatsoever. And since we're on the topic of intrusive thought, I remember, and I can't remember the names of any of these creators involved, but in about 2022, there was a creator that had OCD that was talking about like some of her like darker intrusive thoughts, which honestly I think is a very like vulnerable thing to do. 100%. Because most people don't even tell like their own therapists their intrusive thoughts. Like they're usually the sort of thing you're like, I never want to let anybody know this was in my head ever. Yeah. But she was being transparent about it. And a lot of her thoughts centered around like the fear of harming other people, like physically. And there were so many comments that were like, that's not a real intrusive thought. That just means you're effed in the head. Like, all these people that did not have OCD, but were so used to like that cutesy simplification of the term, that when they were confronted with what that term actually was, responded hostilely. And I think that's dangerous.
100%. Yeah. It's frustrating when people don't want to get on board. There's people that I've had conversations with, not just an intrusive thought, but in this concept we're talking about of I forget the term you specifically used.
Semantic shifting.
Semantic shifting. Like even going back to what you said earlier about everyone's a little autistic. I've had friends who, and part of it is like they're joking and jesting because I'm correcting them. They're doubling down. But some of it does feel genuine, and I feel like it comes from a place of like either... Often when people say something like everyone's on the spectrum, I think it's one of two, my personal theory and opinion, but I think it's one of two processes. Either they're trying not to fully acknowledge because they don't register me as disabled as somebody else that they know that's autistic, or they don't want to admit that they're hearing a lot of things that they correlate with and do, and that might make them feel like, they're trying to distance themselves from the conclusion that they might also be autistic. And it's like, sorry, it's like, it's not a, obviously being disabled isn't fun.
No.
But it's not,
the end all be all of your existence. It's just a part of you.
You were who you were 5 minutes before you found out. Like, you're the same person.
That's also why I don't understand why there's been and it's not a lot of people, but there's been sort of this uptick in people claiming that autism isn't a disability at all. Because I feel like that logic has to be rooted in the idea that you think disability is a dirty word. You think it is a demeaning word. You think that implies that you are lesser than, and none of those things are true.
People that are looking for superpowers.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I was thinking of the telepathy tapes. It's my favorite conspiracy theory because I think it's so funny. Have you seen anything of it?
No.
Okay. This is a crude summary. Nobody crucify me. Basically, a theory that we have.
Because you said, I'm so sorry, because you said that at my first, I was like, it's not like explaining things is your whole thing.
We have telepathy.
Right.
We can communicate with each other. We have this magical realm called the Hill where we subconsciously project ourselves and go to talk shit about neurotypical people.
That's funny.
I'm sorry. I think it's so honestly very damaging implications behind it. But just on a surface level, I'm like, that's hilarious.
It's a funny concept.
Going to congregate with all my girls on the Hill. We're going to have the rest of this conversation telepathically.
I think that's funny. This is a funny concept. I do think it's a funny concept because there's always like things that people just immediately get. Like when I do the baseball card thing, I explain it for the audience, but when I say it's like a baseball card, immediately people pick up on it.
Yeah, you just do.
And I think it's funny. I think it's funny when we're able to pick up on the same cues because that's specifically like one of the things is like that we don't pick up cues. Mm-hmm. And that honestly is leading me to a concept that I've been looking into more recently, but it's in the communication developments between autistic people versus between non-autistic and neurotypical people. Because there's like a whole untapped area of like understanding where like, because we don't know how to form, for lack of a better phrasing, language the way non-autistic people do, we start forming our own language.
Yes.
And like especially with the lower levels, level 1s and level 2s, that becomes a consistent way of communicating.
Yes.
And I think that that's interesting.
It's very comforting, honestly. Like, especially like when you meet another person like on the spectrum for the first time.
Right.
I still remember like the first Hispanic woman that I met on the spectrum. It happened when I was 20. So pretty far down the line. But I remember like just like looking at her looking at me and like, I see into you. Like, I know you. I don't know you, but I know you, you know? Right. And there's like, it's honestly very comforting because oftentimes it does feel very isolating, especially if, you're the first to get diagnosed or if you're in an area that just doesn't have a lot of neurodiverse people. But when you finally meet one, it feels like you finally have somebody that gets like those little niche life experiences and that can also validate them. It can validate that you're not alone, that you're not crazy, that this is just sometimes the way that things go.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think that's interesting. I think that's reanalyzing what the term autism means, I think, is interesting. Like, the original interpretation was very blunt, very literal, of like, he's in his own little world, I think was a common phrasing. Mm-hmm. And now understanding that the way I explain it, so when I explain my personal interpretation of what autism is, I say it's a processing disorder.
Yes.
It's a thing of like, our brains are incapable of deciphering what is and is not important information. Mm-hmm. So often one of two things happens. Either our brains completely ignore all stimuli or we absorb all stimuli. Yeah. And that's how you have variances. There's still no clear understanding of why the variances exist in these two, pathways. But so far that seems to be the consistent thing is like, and that's what leads to the different variances and levels. Because I feel like if I was assessed when I was like 4, I probably would have been a level 2. Mm. Now that I'm into, I am confirmadly considered level 1. And it's because there's things that I overcame, but nobody knows why I overcame this. It's a flip of the coin. Like, Like I remember understanding that there was a language everyone spoke. I didn't know I was supposed to speak that until I tried. And I remember that like moment as a existing being, like deciding that I was going to learn a new language.
Yes.
It sucks because it was English. My grandparents are so disappointed they're Mexican.
Oh, that's so sad.
Why couldn't it be Spanish? No, I'm kidding. It's so funny though to think of it that way, because it's like, I learned English. Why can't I learn these other languages?
Like in terms of like learning that language,
Yeah.
I do think now another like one of the like the consistent controversies is people treating autism like it's just a childhood disorder. It's not. It affects you your entire life. But I do think it is common for things to get easier as the person ages, because an adult is able to have an autonomy that a child does not.
Right.
You get to pick clothes that are comfortable for you. If an event is overstimulating for you, you know what you can do as an adult? You can leave. You are in control of the people that you get to socialize with. You are in control of the food that you eat, for better or for worse. Your sleep schedule. You get to control so many aspects that just affect your long-term ability to process and cope with the world around you. Whereas a child, it's entirely at the whims of other people.
Yeah.
And I think that's why you see that. I think that's why children's symptoms tend to be a lot more severe. In part because, you know, they're growing and developing, but in part because also children aren't generally afforded autonomy, which I think is very unfortunate.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the double empathy problem?
The double empathy?
Yes.
Can you explain further?
Yeah. If it's not double empathy, I'm about to be so embarrassed, but I'm pretty sure that's what it's called.
I've heard like a ton of...
It's this idea. It's based off a study that... And it's one of those studies that sounds like, duh, when you you say it out loud. But, you know, sometimes you need these things, you know, proven in an academic context for them to be taken seriously. The idea that neurotypical people can effectively communicate and empathize with other neurotypical people. And autistics are capable of doing that with other autistics. But when you attempt to mix these groups, that's when like these huge clashes occur. Right. And those clashes are like sort of the foundations of like a lot of like the prejudices that autistic people receive, and then a lot of the resentment that is developed, counter response, that sort of thing.
No, yeah, I definitely think that that's prevalent. I for some reason I thought you were going to talk about super empathy.
Oh,
which is
hyper
like
empathy,
whole
other thing
concept. Which I always remembered as super because that's how it was phrased in Hannibal.
In Hannibal, yes, it was phrased in Hannibal. 3 or 2. The way Will defines his autism is so crazy. I don't remember the metaphor they use exactly, but they kind of say something along the lines of like, "Are you the super genius or stabbing people kind?" And I'm like, that's how we're distinguishing.
Terrible, awful.
Just those two types.
It's so weird watching like the evolution of autistic representation, because I always feel like as inconsistent as his portrayal was, the attempt to use actual terminology I think was a lot more on point than like, you know, I bring it up a lot, but The Good Doctor or Atypical.
Don't talk to me about The Good Doctor.
I get frustrated, and some people have tried, you know, in recent months. I'm trying not to give it so much strife, because in recent months people have tried to point out to me, it's like they're representing a very specific type, and it's like you can say that, but it's also like that's always the version they want to portray.
And the thing is, everybody's obsessed with savants, and I get it, because savants are pretty interesting, like to learn about, like that's an interesting idea, like this person that can learn this way, or that can host like these this multitude, these multitudes of information, but nobody portrays savants correctly, and that's kind of what pisses me off when people use that argument, because I'm like, okay, I get it that they're portraying a savant, but savants themselves have said this is not an accurate like portrayal of like how a savant
like the whole, you know, the biggest thing for me, especially with The Good Doctor, the thing that I find so egregious is how he's interpreted emotion after starting from such a specific monotone. Yeah. Like monotone is the descriptor, and so he does what he thinks is it, but it's like, no, like if I can use someone who hasn't claimed autism or anything, but I think is a good example of what actual monotone personality sounds like, is April Ludgate. The way she talks is like, that is how someone who's in general monotone sounds. And I think that that's more accurate to what they're trying to depict than what he's depicting, because it sounds very out of, you know, Robotronic. Yes. I can't think of a better word. I think I just made up a word.
I like it though. Robotronic. It's got a good vibe to it. Yeah. But do you want to know an interesting problem that's kind of emerged because of Atypical and The Good Doctor? Yeah. So I have multiple friends that are autistic actors, right? And because, autistic people are becoming more visible, there are more autistic roles being written.
Right.
But the problem is they want the good doctor variant.
Exactly.
These people don't sound like quote unquote the stereotype. They're capable of inflections. They talk like you and me. And because they don't do the good doctor robotronics, they are not cast as autistic characters because the producers do not believe they visually read as autistic, which is such a problem because I'm like, what do you mean somebody visually reads as autistic,
to me, it's the new, can you sound more Mexican?
Can you sound more Mexican?
Yeah.
And, oh God, but I think what angers me the most about the good doctor especially, it's not even the way that autism is portrayed, it's the way that they justify the way everyone around him treats him.
Yeah.
Because he's treated like an idiot most of the time. Like
it's frustrating.
Despite him being as accomplished and intelligent as he is, everybody treats him like a child.
Yeah.
And the fact that they treat him as a child is treated as justifiable and correct.
To me, that's the distinction. And it's going back to something I mentioned before about Michael J. Fox's portrayal in Scrubs. Mm-hmm. He's not portraying an autistic person, but I do think that there's a difference in how it's written.
Yes.
And I don't know a lot about the writer behind Scrubs, but I do like that comparison specifically. When you look at how normalized the treatment of the good doctor is, it I believe to what you're saying is it's not addressed in the show.
Yeah.
Nobody's acknowledging that they're treating him differently or that they're treating him badly, and it's just expected that that's how you handle somebody who's autistic.
Yes.
And so when you rewatch the Super Doc episode, I forget what it's actually called, of Scrubs, the 2-part episode of Michael J. Fox, something that I see in not only in how it's written but how he's portraying the character is they want to treat him with kid gloves because of his obsessive compulsive disorder, and he has to roll with that. Yeah. There's moments where and he comes off snarky and cocky. He's no, he's acknowledging, when you actually look at what he's saying and how he's acting, he's acknowledging that he's disabled, and he's acknowledging that it's the first thing people notice. And but the biggest thing is he's not being cocky. He's acknowledging when he's good at something because he knows he had to work twice, 3 times as hard to get good at it. And nobody knows what it was like till he was good at it. Mm-hmm. They only see what he is now, and they think of him as this cocky a-hole that comes in and makes everyone look bad. And it's yeah, but you weren't there, the 20, 30 years before where he was just... And that's why they have that moment at the end of the episode where he's flipping the switch, and you actually see, and he says nobody's supposed to see this, and he's frustrated. He's not frustrated with JD. He's frustrated that he has to deal with it, and it's this is his normal life. This is his night. What do you call it? Another Monday for him is being stuck flipping, washing his hands, flipping the switch until he feels right. Mm-hmm. And I think that a lot of that, I personally believe that Michael J. Fox used experience with. I don't want to get it wrong. Cerebral palsy, or is it Lou Gehrig's disease?
I thought he had Parkinson's.
I knew it was. I knew that I knew it, but I couldn't remember.
Have you seen recent videos of him? He's actually doing a lot better right now.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, it's really good to see.
Keeps not for some reason. I think I don't know how these people know each other, but the fact that Coldplay keeps putting him in their concerts,
that is interesting.
I think it's super cool.
Yeah.
I think it started with the bit where he got him to play Johnny B. Good, and now it's just he puts him in everything. But yeah, and he got it good enough to a while back. He fluctuates. I think with the way most, you can't really anticipate how that'll manifest. But I know that he did a sitcom for a while. And he's doing more cameo shows. He's doing more live performances, which I think is dope.
Yeah.
But I definitely think that the years before that was too much to hide, where he had to acknowledge he was disabled and had to acknowledge people acknowledging that he was disabled, influenced how he portrayed that doctor.
Yes.
And I think that that's a good portrayal of somebody living with disability and existing in public with disability. And that's also part of what fuels the drive for the show is to showcase people and share their experiences of that specific concept of not only our experiences being disabled and being neurodivergent, but also how that manifests in public and how we interact. Yeah.
Oh man, that's a great way of putting it. No notes. I was thinking I have such mixed feelings, specifically on the show Atypical as well, because I don't like Atypical. I think it says a lot about a show if the show is supposed to be about an autistic person and people go, it has great lesbian rep, and that's like the first thing they say. Yeah. I'm like, not that it's a bad thing the show has great lesbian rep.
No, yeah, but the sister definitely takes over.
But before the autism, you know, but the only like kind of kudos I'll give it is that it broke down like to my family in like little itty bitty baby terms, certain phenomena I was experiencing. I still don't think it's a great depiction of that phenomenon, but when trying to valiantly defend my honor, as my younger sister so often does, she would often have to resort to, do you remember when Sam and Atypical, da, 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 and I'm like, the fact I'm compared to Sam from Atypical, but it is the thing that like helps them click. So at the same time, I'm like, I just wish we had better versions of that. I wish we had versions that were more authentic to our experience.
I've seen some like admirable attempts, like Everything Will Be Okay.
Yes.
That's, before I get into it, because I have a thought I don't want to forget.
Yes.
I think specifically what irks me about the show, beyond, you know, the specific details of the individual representation, is the concept. It feels like a reverse Han Solo effect. Where like, so there's this whole, you know, I'm about to go into a deep rabbit hole. There's an old video from crack.com of After Hours where they talk about...
What a throwback, my God.
Where they talk about the
audience is going to see me crumbling into dust and blowing away with the wind.
So but reaching back to 2012, I think it's like their second or third season, they did an episode talking about the main character concept of like they talk about the main character has to be bland so that you can
project yourself onto them.
And so that's why all the other characters, everyone's favorite character, is not someone they think of being, but someone that they want to be friends with. So it's like the Han Solos, the Chewbaccas. But the thing about that concept is that you can't make a show or movie about the cool character. Because it's unidentifiable, it's unrelatable. You know, everyone wants to be Superman, but no one can imagine being Superman, kind of a concept. And I think this is sort of the reverse of a show where the descriptor surrounds a main character, but he's not the main character of the show. Yeah. Like he's the vehicle that drives the concept forward. Yeah. Everyone's in this universe because it's called Atypical. Yeah. So there's, you know, because this autistic guy exists, but the show's almost not about him. It's about, you know, the girlfriend that he locks in the closet. It's about, it's about his sister. Yeah. It's about his parents dealing with him.
And what I think is like sad about like Atypical being such a powerful form of representation is that he almost exclusively like exists to drive conflict. Yeah. There are so like few positive things that happen in the show. It's like, I feel like he's treated as like this sort of like cumbersome burden. And it's like, watch Sam as he ruins the life of all of his family members. And
he's when that's caffeinated crystal. Yes. Like, see how they react.
Yes, when that's a curse that's already like ascribed autistic people, that does not have to be true and very often is not. But it's frustrating that one of the most mainstream sources of autistic representation is sort of like a vehicle for this thought, you know?
Exactly. Yeah, and that's something that that's like the biggest reason why like I argue against the shows. And I tell people, like, you know, we're not gonna fight if you like the show. Yeah.
It doesn't mean you're evil.
Yeah, I understand why you like the show. Yeah. It's not a poorly written show. Yeah. But when this is your reference for what I should like or for how you see me.
Yeah, or for how I should behave in your eyes.
It's like, you know, you're not even talking about the main character. Mm-hmm. You know, you're talking about the Chewbacca, the R2-D2 of it all. Yes. And there's some shows, I forget what it's called. There was one on Amazon that I still have yet to finish. But it was written by and casted by autistic people. There was, as I mentioned, Everything Is Gonna Be Okay. That one was it was a decent one. But the thing that I thought was funny was that one of the main characters of that show, who is actually a claimed and identified autistic actor, is now on The Good Doctor as his intern.
Oh, I see.
And I think that this concept is hilarious. One, because they make her, I don't know if the character even identifies autistic.
Yes.
I kind of feel like they casted her as a sort of validation thing of like, well, if she likes the show.
I remember this controversy. I don't remember the actress's name, but I remember a lot of people were upset with her for even going on The Good.
Josh just put it here.
Yes, she'll project it.
Yeah.
Everything that we don't know or remember is going to be cast on.
But to me, it's so funny because regardless of if she's portraying that, I believe that she's just portraying like her interpretation of the character, which for me means that, at least in her eyes, potentially the character is autistic because she's just playing herself. And I think that comparison is funny because you have an actually autistic person acting autistic on the show, and it's a direct comparison to what you're seeing is someone's perception of autism. And it's like you can see the difference. And I see clips on it on TikTok all the time, and I even comment this. I was like, it's so frustrating to me that she's actually doing a good job, but everyone will always use him as the reference point because he's the main character.
When he's not even autistic, that's the bit that drives me crazy. I often find that some of my favorite examples of like autistic representation are characters that were like not consciously written as autistic.
I talk about this a lot.
Yes.
I have this theory that because writers are pulling from people they know, they'll write a character that has characteristics. And because they're not looking at them as autistic, but they're just looking at it as a person. They give a lot of personality and, what's the word? Thoughtfulness. There's another word, but I can't remember it. In creating the character. And so I feel like there's times where people are basing character on autism and just not realizing it. I have like a whole list of examples. Like I think Raymond Holt is one of the more obvious ones, but also in congruence with Raymond Holt, Jake kind of shows signs of ADHD. I think that Elliot Reed from Scrubs is autistic. Yes. And I think there's a lot of like short, funny, more stereotypical, but in the way she misses cues, and it's not just because she's like a rich white girl. It's like also like she doesn't understand people.
It literally just does not.
Yeah.
There was this book that I loved. I still love it, but it's called Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata. And Sayaka Murata, in all of her books, she likes to focus on women that are very othered by society.
Right.
And this character is never like explicitly clarified as autistic, but she is sorry, I'm doing some math. What is 18 plus 18? She's a 36-year-old woman that has been working in a convenience store since she was 18. So she's been working there for 18 years, or for like the equivalent of like an entire lifespan.
Right.
And she likes the convenience store because it has like an actual manual on how to handle every single interaction, every single exchange. So it's the one place where she feels, I'm doing very, very well. I'm doing exactly what I'm supposed to be doing. And it goes into like a lot into like the profound sense of alienation she feels from other people, like how she relies on like other female family members to sort of navigate social settings for her, or to how to be like to feed her on like lines on how to be. But what I think is very, very comforting about the story, because at the point in the story, because she's 36, everybody's like, why are you still here? Why have you not moved on? Why have you not done? Why have you not hit all these necessary life checkpoints? And her answer is simply, I don't want to. Most of the book revolves around her trying to fit like this very specific definition of what she should be, but it ultimately concludes with her pursuing her own vision of happiness, even though it doesn't align with what is culturally or socially acceptable. And I think that's a very like touching and relatable story to the autism experience in general. But I definitely also have those characters. Honestly, there's a couple characters where if somebody was like, why? I'm like, I can't provide enough justification. It's in my soul. They just are to me.
Yeah, like I'll try to remember. It's such a specific thing of like, I can't describe it. I can only show you the clips that make it seem like, I mentioned Raymond Holt, and I feel like for most people, if they agree with this, it's because he's a very blunt, literal person. But for me, it's like specific things that he says. Like the three moments that stick out in my head are the first moment is there's an episode where Jake, his favorite pizza place, burns down, and they keep mentioning that his partner Boyle has a vlog, and you find out Holt follows. He's the only one that talks about mouthfeel. And the second one is the group retreat episode where Jake feels bad because Holt's never had, work friends, so he invites him, and now the boss is at the thing, and they're in the jacuzzi, and he says, "Can we turn off these distracting bubbles?" And then he goes, "Finally, no more stagnant water." But the most funniest thing to me is the episode where Rosa is about to marry Pimento. And he's obsessed with this balloon arch the entire episode. And he's upset that he has to burst it. And he's being so, like, for lack of a sassy and upset. Yes. But is the credit scene where Rosa walks into his office and she sees the balloon arch. And she goes, "This is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." And he pauses. And then literally right before they cut out to black, he goes, "Validation!" And then it cuts to black. It's stuff like that where it's like, those are the moments that are autistic.
And it's so funny because they're so small, but you're like, it speaks to our clicks. Experience. Like,
I just thought of another. Have you ever seen My Name is Earl?
I have seen My Name is Earl. I love My Name is Earl.
For me,
I feel like My Name is Earl is like, I mean, it was acclaimed back in its day, but I wish it like re-entered the cultural conversation. It's so good. It holds up so well.
It's such a specific like era of television. But for me, Randy is autistic. And there's so many moments, but specifically the one that stands out in my head as a reference, and it's, a little stereotypical. It's like, they're doing an episode where they're like, it's strange the random things that you'll remember. And every time they reference this concept, they're referencing Randy remembering something. And he's like working on his florist. And he's like, "Can we use a different vase? This one makes my toes hurt."
Oh my God.
Yeah, it's like little moments like that the characters do that I'm like, that guy's autistic. Yeah.
You see it. Oh gosh. I'm trying to think of some of mine. The one that I'm thinking of, I don't want to even say.
Do it.
Okay. Haru from Beastars to me is autistic, just to me. I think the reason I view her that way, two things. The author describe
I'm so sorry.
She's viewed as being very immature, but the audience clarifies that she views her, the author clarifies that she views her as very childishly sincere. And I feel like that's kind of a way autistic women tend to be viewed, that sort of infantilization or that youthfulness. But I think because we associate grown women as having to have this sort of tact and this pre-knowledge of what is and is not appropriate to say, that when women are blunt and forthright and transparent, that is viewed as being childlike, which is interesting because those qualities are viewed as being adult in men.
Yeah.
So that's part of why, because a lot of people will say she's very immature, and I'm like, I don't think she's necessarily mature. She's just being very transparent. She's not beating around the bush. But two, the way that she seeks to relate to other people, when she learns that she cannot be socially accepted in female circles, when she learns that she's either reduced to an object to be pitied or something to just sort of when she realizes that she never gets to be a person, she gravitates towards these really big extremes to be seen as one. And the extremes that she gravitates towards, I've seen autistic women gravitate towards in real life. I think it's very touching to that experience, and and because it's kind of taboo the way that she goes about it, I think a lot of people don't make that connection. But if you've seen women you love go through it, you say, yeah, I see that. I
definitely think there's a lot of anime characters that can fall There's two shows in my head that were a lot of the characters come off that way.
Yes. Which ones?
For me, have you seen Bee and Puppy yet?
Yes. I think everybody.
When I explain this show to me, I tell people I can't just say that this character is. I think this show is autism.
It is.
Every single character, there's some way, the way they interact and perceive each other, and the way they sometimes can't perceive past their own immediate, even though they're all interacting, is very level 1, level 2.
Yes.
And it's just so hard to explain without show. It's also such a weird watch because there's shenanigans happening, but they're so calm about it. Yeah. I make the joke that it's like if Steven Universe was produced by the people that made Caillou.
I like it.
It's a very soft show. It's a very polite and content. Yeah. But it is technically a show for adults. They say, not to be crude, but they say crotch in the first episode. You know what I mean? It's not meant for children. It's meant for adults. But it's a cartoon. That one, and then one that I think is more obvious is Senshi Laos and
Oh crap!
Delicious in Dungeon.
Yes, I was about to be like, it's Dungeon something. Why am I blanking on this? I love that show.
The dwarf, the fighter, and the elf priestess. I think are all at this.
All of them.
And it's so funny. Senshi is my favorite character.
I love that show.
He's so obsessed with cooking. He doesn't care what's going on.
Yeah,
like they're captured and they're in prison, and all he can think about is like, you guys stole my ingredients for bread. Like, you can have the bread, just let me make the bread.
Oh, that's
it's so funny. I love that show so much.
Oh, it's such a nice watch too. I love shows like that, like where you can like identify your own experience so strongly, even if it's like in a very subtle way, because you're like, yes, there we are. Nobody knows, but we do.
Yeah, I definitely love that. I haven't had a chance to. Well, I wanted to mention this.
Yes.
You know, we obviously have gone through our shows and characters, but that's something you're kind of known for is dissecting and reviewing. I don't even know if I'd call it reviewing. I don't know what you call it, because I think it's more than just your impressions. I think you like analyze and
I try to
break down the shit, and I think you're very perceptive, and I think it's an interesting experience seeing your interpretation either after a show I've seen or usually, like, sometimes you introduce me to shows you're the reason I saw Kevin Can Go Fuck Himself.
I love Kevin Can Go Fuck Himself.
It's such a great show.
Yeah.
My little brother hates it.
He doesn't like it.
He has this thing about characters that are intentionally like
obtuse.
Not just obtuse, but like characters that are intentionally not neutral. What's the word I'm looking for? Ambiguous about their morality.
Oh, he doesn't like morally ambiguous characters.
It's a thing of like either they're supposed to be the bad guy or they're not, and it's the ambiguity around whether or not she's a good person by the end of the show.
Oh yeah.
Not to spotlight on my little brother. Like, I get why some people don't like the show, but I think it's an interesting concept, and I definitely think like what they're analyzing is important.
Honestly, I really like breaking down media with like other like autistic content creators, because I think, and not to say that neurotypical content creators can't do this as well, but I think that we are more likely to default to, like, because so much of our life is trying to decipher the implications behind what everybody is saying, because so much of like our day-to-day survival is reliant on it, we focus very heavily on like subtle implications the audience may not immediately catch, or like the subtext behind all these interactions, all these exchanges, or I think a lot of like autistic women especially try and understand why people act the way they do. Like, I think that's like a big, like, I think it's like a big source of comfort or like clarification for a lot of people to be able to seek out that knowledge. And even if they're acting like a jerk, you're like, oh, I know why you're acting like it, so I can be at peace with myself. So I think that's another big focus, focusing on why they're doing these things that may not make sense. Or honestly, what kind of bothers me about the way that a lot of neurotypical people break down media is that they're so focused on just the logic of the actions. And I'm like, the logic is the least interesting part
boring.
It's so boring. Yeah. You want a show where everyone does the right thing every single time and it always works out and there's no conflict. Get a life.
No, I don't know why that made me think of there's this clip I saw from which show is it? Blackish.
I've never seen any of the ishes. Mixed-ish, grown-ish. I've never seen any. I
started watching Blackish like when it first came out, and I just fell out of it. And it's just like I absorb so much media that I just fall behind. I fall behind and then I catch up, and then or like something everyone's watching, and I just wait till it's bingeable and I watch all of it.
Sometimes, and this is bad, large gaps of information leave my mind.
Yeah. But so there's this episode. I don't remember. They're having troubles. And they're having a discussion about things that they're not acknowledging in each other.
Yes.
And there's this flashback moment where she's like, I told you that I like flowers and you never get me flowers. And then he's like, you know why I don't get you flowers? And they go to the flashback and it's such a mild thing. And I know what it's supposed to look like.
Yes.
So essentially what happens is he leaves all these little Post-its. And it's like their first year. They're supposed to be like 18 in the flashback or something, or it's 20. So he thinks that he's doing something really sweet and specific. He leaves all these Post-its, and then the Post-its lead to like serving dish, a presentation dish, and it's a single rose. And then the conflict is supposed to be that she misinterpreted and thought he was joking because he only gave her one rose. But then you think about it, it's like, yeah, but normal people don't act like that.
Yeah.
Like, I know I'm autistic, but it's like you left a bunch of Post-its for a single rose. Like, if anything, if they wanted it properly, and it's, I got into like huge argument with a bunch of people, and I was like, you don't understand what I'm saying. The concept makes sense. The writing, the idea that they're trying to write makes sense. They just portrayed it in such a ridiculous manner that it's like, I don't identify with this.
Yes.
And it's like, you could have kept it so much simpler of him presenting the rose to her and then her just looking upset, disappointed. And then the whole concept that you portrayed in this weird comedic moment perfectly, much more real, especially that you're going from a comedic flashback to a serious conversation. It's just so jarring.
You know, I feel like that I've had arguments like this over like Diane and Mr. Peanut Butter from BoJack Horseman, because I feel like when it comes to their relationship, so many people are like being willfully dense towards the issues they have.
Yeah, they just
like
want to defend the Labrador guy.
Yeah, and I get it. He's a cute Labrador Retriever. Everybody loves a Labrador Retriever.
I don't know about you. I don't like Mr. Peanut Butter.
I don't like Mr. Peanut Butter at all.
And I want to be clear about like my association with the show. I'm not a avid viewer.
Yeah, not avid BoJack.
I saw the first 2 seasons in their entirety though, and it's like I don't think it's a bad show. I think it's a great show, and I understand why people like it. It was a show that came at a time where it's like I was just tired of watching like this villains have a story. For lack of a better term, it's like it's a very unique and dynamic show, but it stresses me out.
Oh yeah, season 2 is special. If it's any consolation, season 2 is as stressful as it gets for a minute, and then you get season 5, which is even worse.
It's like a series I won't watch. The Bear. It's like The Bear's a great show, great actors, very stressful.
I can't watch The Bear. My sister showed me the lunch rush scene, like the famous one,
just doesn't,
where he smacks the donut to the ground, and I'm like, this gives me war flashbacks to
that's like
my
I stopped
own
watching.
work experience.
And then season 2 is supposed to be like his direct like flashbacks to his trauma. But reeling back into something on Mr. Peanut Butter, he feels disingenuous.
Yes.
And it's more just like that I know people like that in real life.
Yes.
And there's like, there's celebrities that I think that are like that. And he's just like such a specific reference to me that I'm like, so I don't think he ever does anything necessarily bad in the show, but I just don't like him. Like I don't trust him,
So if you only watched the first 2 seasons, you never saw the library episode. So I'm pretty sure that episode is in episode 3, but it's kind of like in the same vein as like the Rose thing. Yeah. So his girlfriend Diane talks about how she always loved like the library from Beauty and the Beast, which honestly, if you were a little girl that read, you wanted that library. I still kind of want that library. So he builds her the library, but fills it with fake books, 1. But 2, she specifically said that she never really wanted to see this like in real life. It was just like a childhood fantasy, because obviously Diane doesn't like these big grand gestures. They put a lot of pressure on her to react. They make her feel stressed instead of happy. Yeah. And so when Mr. Peanut Butter does this, it becomes a huge fight between them, and everybody goes, well, Diane's such a raging bitch. And I'm like, she specifically said what she wants.
Yeah. It's such a funny concept. Like the fact that he tried, I'm like, yeah, but when you really think about it, his listening comprehension, did he really try?
Yeah, did he really try?
Yeah.
And it's funny because sometimes I feel like I understand fiction a lot better than I understand people, but I feel like it makes sense because fiction's such a contained medium. You get a lot of time to digest the interactions that you're seeing.
Yeah. It's so funny how that just reminds me of experience I've had in person, like when it comes to gifts and ideas of gifts. Not with me specifically, but usually when I'm a reference point for someone else.
Yes.
Because I've run into a lot of circumstances where, like, somebody wants to gift a gift for someone, is like, and we're shopping together, and I see something that I know that other person will like, and I'm like, get them this.
Yes.
And they're like, that's ugly. And I'm like, and it's such a frustrating conversation. She's like, it's not for you.
Yes.
Like, you asked me to be your reference point. This is what they like.
Yes.
And they're like, I want to get him something that I enjoy getting them. It's like,
and I think a lot of people get trapped in their head and they're like, I'll get something I do, and I'm like, this isn't about it. Yeah. Honestly, I feel sometimes I feel like holding like the little hypnosis coin and being like, this isn't about you. Look beyond yourself for 30 seconds. Yeah.
It's such a funny concept. The flip side of that is also like being a going back to what we said, being a translate. I finally remembered an example.
Yes.
My brother Dominic likes, for a while, he was very into a very specific type of sock. So So every year for Christmas or his birthday, when people asked what he wanted, he would just say socks. Nobody knew what he meant by that. And nobody got him it because like, I don't want to just buy you socks. And so I'd have to be like, you have to understand, he means specific socks. He means zany socks. So then they started getting like Snoopy and Raiders. And it's like, no. It's so much more simpler than that. Not wacky socks, zany socks. That's the distinction. It's like, it's odd enough that it's different.
Yes.
But it's not weird.
Yes.
So I'm like, if you find a sock with a bunch of squiggles and polka dots, those are the kind of socks. You know what I mean? Like stripes, zigzags, anything that'd be on the background of a Rugrats episode. Those are the socks that he likes.
Such a good description. The Rugrats episode.
And people started doing that. He would wear the socks finally. It's a funny concept. And there's like some small moments like that where being able to translate for people comes in handy.
It really does.
Yeah.
And I think it's honestly like such a healing point, like especially my family was always like very accepting even prior to knowing, but it's so healing when they're like, yep, go do whatever you need to do. Like sometimes I'm like, hi, I need to go stim around my room for like 10 minutes and they'll be like, go.
Yeah, I do. That's like a thing I do with my family where I either bring headphones to a function or I just step out.
Yes.
Like, I live with my dad right now and him and my stepmom host family dinner. Yeah. And, there'll be moments where I'll just like be able to like, I'll be right back.
Yes.
And then I'm just like gone for maybe an hour. And it's like, I'm literally just decompressing in my room.
Same here.
And then I come back.
I'll just be like, I'll be right back.
Yeah.
Need my decompression. And then it works out great.
Because at the end of the day, it's not actually like that's been because when I was a kid, if I did something like that, people think I'm being selfish. And now that I'm an adult and I can express why, they're a lot more understanding. And the thing about it is like they've gotten so used to it that it doesn't affect anybody because it never would have affected anybody. I just need space sometimes. Yeah. And then I'm back.
And it's honestly crazy the amount of things like autistic children or autistic teenagers are restricted from doing that impact nobody.
Yeah.
That have zero effect, like positive or negative effect. It's just like control for the sake of control. And that's honestly what's so nice about being an adult is that you never have to like indulge in that again unless like very specific circumstances. But even then, you don't really have to. There's not the obligation,
Yeah, that's why I'm interested to see. We should start writing.
Yeah, we should.
We'll write it out. This is the last thing I'm commenting because I definitely think there's so much more. I definitely would like to have you back on the podcast.
That'd be great
in the future. Maybe next time we'll talk about like autistic movies because I've noticed a very specific concept that's been coming out every like 5 years and people keep tagging me in it. And I don't know if they're trolling me or not, but it's always like a dad who travels for work and his autistic son. Yeah. And him explaining to people while him also learning. I'm like, I get that this is a perspective and I get that this is a concept, but you guys made this with Paul Rudd like 20 years ago. Like I'm tired.
And they and it worked great. So we're going to
Jerry Maguire was such a good no. Well, yeah, we'll definitely get into it more. But thank you again for being on the show.
Of course,
we'll leave a link to all your TikTok and YouTube pages at the bottom. Lucky Leftie. Is there anything else you want to promote?
No, thank you for having me on here. I had a great time. Yeah. Looking forward to next time. Autistic movies. I'll be ruminating. I'll be trying. I'll be cooking up some new concepts.
For sure. Yeah. If there's a character you think is autistic, let us know in the comments.
Oh, yes, please.
And
you don't need to have a justification.
Just say it and we'll talk about it later.
Yes.
And still don't have an outro. I gotta work on my outros.
Oh, yeah. Outros are terrible because you just wanna.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.